As I said last week, I have for quite a number of years tried to begin the first couple of weeks in the new year with a theme on forgiveness. It's a great way to remember how to plant our feet on the path of life in the reality of everyday living. The first thing you noticed about him was his eyes. They were steel blue, confident. He cut a striking figure. Me in a few years, except my eyes are quite blue. He cut a striking figure for a man of 60 years old. Tall, fit, firm step, movement, graying hair slightly, just looks so good. All of those went together with his eyes to say that here was someone who's in control. Here's someone strong. Someone to be admired, someone to watch, someone to follow. And in fact, his life bore witness to what his eyes said. Now here's where it diverges from the picture. As senior partner in his law practice, he was known to be a firm and yet not overbearing businessman. The eyes said it all. Calm, confident, in control. But when she came into church, her eyes told the ushers that she wasn't one of us. What alarmed the ushers about her, especially her eyes, was that they were at once both empty and full, distant, and yet had this searching gaze of intensity about her. The emptiness and the distance spoke of a life to them that was far more than could be healthy for anyone to see. Spoke of pains far too deep to be mentioned in polite, ordinary church conversations. It spoke of even a disregard for polite conversation, and instead spoke of a hunger for what is real and true, and all of that gathered in an instant glance at this woman and making a snap judgment. All of this alarmed the ushers and made them nervous. But old Blue Eyes, calm, confident, and in control, his eyes took her in as she prepared to enter the sanctuary, and instantly he also knew the same thing. She's not one of us. And he knew more. Those eyes of that woman revealed how volatile and uncertain she probably was. Her clothes, oh my goodness, and her smell, definitely something not right here. And he thought, I bet you she's forgotten something. The Sunday morning facade that everyone knows when they go to church, that everyone says everything is just tickety-boo. It's hunky-dory. My life is great. Because you see, in church and polite conversation, he thought, we don't tell things as they really are. I bet she's forgotten or she never knew. And so she's dangerous. He was gratified, though, to hear the usher ask her, wouldn't you prefer to sit up in the back of the balcony? With the unspoken thought behind it. Out of sight, out of smell, and out of mind. So assured that the situation was well in hand and under control, Blue Eyes, Mr. Calm, confident, and collected, went and sat near the very front of the sanctuary. But it wasn't a minute later when she appeared standing in the aisle right beside him, with an usher just a few feet away with a frazzled look on his face of mouthing the words, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm sorry. And he turned his legs so that she could get by, and she squeezed by him, and wouldn't you know it, she had to sit down right beside him in the front pew. He knew that this woman with those eyes shouldn't be here in this place. his space, up close to God. God only knew what she would likely do in here, and he was sure that God would not be too pleased if she did it when she did it. So he decided right then and there that the safest thing he would do would be to calmly and coolly and confidently keep the situation, when it arises, from getting out of hand. Once she was seated, she closed her eyes. She bowed her head. She began to pray. He thought this odd. He busied himself with reading through the bulletin, turning around and greeting people in polite conversation who were sitting around him, behind him. And then suddenly a slight flush crossed his face as he heard her. She was crying. My goodness. Ever so softly, but crying nonetheless. What is this? He considered briefly, trying to quietly and gently, but firmly escort her out of the sanctuary. No business. She had no business being there, crying. But before he could act, the minister entered the sanctuary and began with the announcements. And to his relief, she stopped crying. And she looked forward, and she wiped her eyes, and she listened as the minister spoke. The opening hymn began. And then he flushed again as he heard her singing. Not at all on key, he thought to himself, and none too well, but in very strong voice. It wasn't that she was singing too loud. It's just that, well, if you weren't in the choir, it was only the choir that tended to sing with gusto. And he was certain that this woman was drawing attention to herself and him sitting beside her because she was singing at the top of her lungs. And therefore, everybody in that crowded sanctuary was hearing her. Serenely unaware of his discomfort, she then listened to the prayer of invocation. And he watched her anxiously as they all sat down and were invited to prepare a bit more of their hearts for worshiping God with the prayer of confession. He noticed that she didn't seem to understand that the prayer of confession was written in the bulletin. In fact, she had ignored the bulletin up to this point in time. So he decided, even though he didn't know what on earth she was doing here, he decided to point out to her. It's right here. Prayer of confession. Right here. He pointed politely, maybe, but certainly condescendingly. But as he did that, she fell off the pew and dropped to her knees to pray, with her hands clasped over the back of the pew in front of her. He stopped. He was alarmed now. He glanced quickly behind him and saw the alarm and the look of concern on other people's faces. And he shrugged his shoulders, he shook his head, and buried his thoughts in the prayer of confession that was printed in the bulletin. As if he was trying to say, I don't have anything to do with this public display that's not acceptable here beside me. And after the prayer, she continued to kneel. She knelt through the assurance of pardon until the last note of the choral Amen. He clenched his jaw. He thought about writing her a note, asking her to please smarten up and behave. But he rejected that idea. Instead, crossed his arms, sat up tall in his pew, and stared hard straight ahead, eyes focused on the minister. She took a small Bible out of her little purse. She was reading scripture. He continued to stare hard straight ahead, as if by doing so he was willing her to disappear, as if pretending that she didn't even exist. And while she read her Bible beside him, he's thinking hard, okay, now, what can we do here? What can we do in this respectable place to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again? I know, maybe I'll propose to the elders next week that they take it to their meeting that we have a designated area for visitors, for guests, up in the back of the balcony. And that way we won't have to worry about something like this again. Well, the reading of Scripture came to an end, and she continued to hold her Bible open, continued to intently read. He could see her lips moving, as if she was reading it aloud, silently to herself. The sermon began, and it seemed to old Blue Eyes that it was an uneventful sermon, just like any other sermon he'd ever heard from their minister. And in fact, just like any other Sunday, his mind began to wander. And he started to think about all the business that he had to do for the coming week, until that sound snapped him out of his thoughts again. She was crying. Again? Seriously? Crying? Would this never end? Her softly sobbing shoulders, as she rolled to the edge of the pew, were moving up and down as she cried. He couldn't understand. Why on earth would somebody behave like this in church? Why was she crying? And then it struck him. He realized, of course, somebody only does these sorts of peculiar things when there is something terribly wrong in their life. That's why she's acting so lost. And then he regained his calm, confident coolness again, because he thought he understood. The sermon came to an end, and she remained hunched forward and seated during the next hymn, and during the Apostles' Creed, when everybody else stood up. But at least he thought to himself, she's not crying anymore. She's beginning to maybe gain her composure. The pastoral prayer was offered without incident, and he was grateful. But then came the call for the offering. The plate came to him. He's sitting at the front. He takes the plate, he reaches into his wallet and pulls out a $5 and puts it on the plate, and he reluctantly passes it to this woman beside him. And she takes it, and she looks at it, and then she puts it on her lap. And his face no longer looked calm and confident, and he was worried. He watched her out of the corner of his eye, thinking, what's she going to do? Is she going to take the offering out of it? Is she going to just sit there with it? Is she just going to hold on to it? And as he watched her, he realized she was reaching up behind her neck, and she undid the clasp of her necklace. And at the end of her necklace was a diamond pendant. And she put the clasp back on, and put the necklace and the diamond on the offering plate, and then passed it to the next person. He couldn't stand it. So he decided, I can't be silent any longer, and he turned to her, and he said, calmly and confidently, Miss, I don't think you understand. But then her eyes met his, and he lost all calmness and confidence, and his voice ran out. And after a pause, this woman said, I think I do understand, because I'm one whom Jesus has forgiven much. And in that moment, he realized that quite probably she did understand something that he didn't. That quite possibly she was the one who was found, and he was the one who was lost. And then she smiled at him, and he saw in her eyes a depth of peaceful joy that he had never seen or experienced in his life.